I'm Ash, but you can call me Icon for short. In recent months, I've become more and more disturbed by a trend within political circles online, specifically left-leaning circles, and I hope to explore it a bit in this video. There's a hard push by many in the online left to win over segments of those radicalized to the right, and at the moment, this effort does not seem to be facing an adequate level of scrutiny. Many white leftists spend a lot of time on de-radicalization, something I've briefly touched on before, and there is a huge wave of new leftists who claim to have come over from the reactionary right. White leftists are open about and almost proud of being former reactionaries, treating their past as a sort of badge of honor. This is kind of concerning to me for a lot of reasons, and I want to spend some time discussing why. Part 1. The Rhetorical Trap. Western political theory generally distinguishes between two sides of a spectrum of political belief, the left and the right. The right wing is typically understood as a collection of viewpoints which place varying levels of importance on three main things: order, tradition, and hierarchy. Conservatism, for example, is a political ideology that understands society as being a meritocratic hierarchy, which basically means your position in society is associated with your merit. It also places importance on cultural tradition and the maintenance of order, often favoring quiet injustice to chaotic equality. Further to the right, we find fascism, an ideology that assumes society should be organized to enforce a hierarchy along the lines of specific in-groups and out-groups, usually tied to some ancient tradition to legitimize the in-group's claim on power. Left-wing ideologies focus on the same issues, but typically with an inverted set of values: freedom, progress, and equality. Progressive liberalism, for example, is a moderate left-wing ideology that believes in abolishing structural inequalities between groups within a capitalist framework, usually attempting to create a more meritocratic version of our current society. It's important to note, liberalism places importance on order and tradition to a lesser extent than conservatism, but it does still prioritize maintaining order within a capitalist framework, and thus will often side against marginalized people. Much further left, anarcho-communism is an ideology which explicitly advocates for the abolition of unjust hierarchies, and the transition to a system of equitable social, political, and economic relations between people. This is a total rejection of hierarchy, maintaining order, and upholding tradition. We could argue about these ideologies quite a bit if we wanted, and there are certainly other ways to interpret the political spectrum, but for our purposes here, this provides a reasonable baseline understanding. From this, we can see something interesting, mainly that the far left and the far right are pretty different in many aspects of how they view the world, but they are still all concerned about mostly the same things. The far right and far left are both concerned with power and how that power is distributed. The far right has taken notice of this, and ever since the near-universal vilification of fascism after the Second World War, they have taken advantage of that fact to disguise their motives and beliefs. Right-wing rhetoric often takes on the appearance of leftist analysis, as we can see with far-right figureheads like Tucker Carlson. These people will often discuss issues using the rhetoric of leftist analysis, and will invoke leftist language when attempting to criticize progressive politics, to blur the boundaries between left and right. For example, calling things like affirmative action racist, or talking about the exploitation of women in Black and brown countries, are invocations of leftist analysis to lend legitimacy to thinly veiled bigotry. The reason the far right criticizes affirmative action isn't because they believe it's racist, it's because they think it upsets the order of society, where they are supposed to be above racial minorities. The reason they criticize the exploitation of women in Black and brown countries isn't because they care about the exploitation of women, but because it allows them to paint a narrative of these countries as being backward, uncivilized, or savage in a way that their countries aren't. It's about maintaining the current order, protecting the hierarchy. This rhetorical sleight of hand is usually pretty effective. It allows the far right to put forward their ideas of in-group superiority and out-group inferiority with an artifice of progressivism, something that makes their ideas much more palatable to the average person, and which allows them to maintain their platforms and status as respectable individuals. It also allows for them to seemingly poke holes in progressive politics through their selective highlighting of left-wing beliefs and actions. These leftists say they care about women's rights, but what about the women in X country? I don't hear them talk about that, they'll say. This typically avoids any facts which might prove inconvenient for this narrative, such as when leftists actually do discuss these issues. Leftists have a tendency to play into this rhetoric pretty badly as well. The faux criticism the far-right levies is easy to dispute on its own terms because they're using leftist language. Simply correct them and explain why they're wrong, and they'll be forced to admit defeat and slither into the shadows. Unfortunately, this is rarely the outcome of such an interaction. The far-right never had any interest in being accurate with their use of this language, so correcting them does nothing. Let me repeat this again. They do not care that they are wrong. The major issue here is that this approach engages with them as though they are simply mistaken or misinformed, an assumption which takes for granted that these people fundamentally view things the same way a leftist does. This is wrong. The far-right may co-opt leftist language, but they are not simply misinformed leftists. They have a fundamentally different perspective on the world that does not map onto leftism. A massive shift in perspective and worldview is required for leftism to even become sensical to them. Part 2. The Myth of the Convert. Now we return to the situation I opened this video with. White leftists online are expending considerable energy on de-radicalization efforts that focus primarily on far-right reactionaries, people whose views are, in many ways, fundamentally different to those of a leftist, and it strikes me as somewhat of an issue. I think there's merit in ensuring the far-right has fewer members, but there's also an interesting prioritization of reactionaries specifically here, something which strikes me as odd. These people have beliefs that differ wildly from those of a leftist. They have assumptions about the world that leftists don't share, but these people are the primary targets for many white leftists. Why is that? Well, it can be partially explained by the rhetorical trap the far-right uses. They co-opt leftist language for their own purposes, and this can lead people to believe that they share beliefs with leftists that they just don't. This model of de-radicalization assumes that people on the far right would agree with leftism if they only had the correct information, and so a lot of effort is put into making that information accessible, and challenging the assumptions these people have about the world based on their inaccurate information. But that's not quite it. As much as I would like for this to be a matter of political literacy, I think there's something a lot more sinister at play here, something that these people may not even be aware of. To see what that is, we have to look at what these de-radicalized people are being taught. Firstly, we can see that a lot of these people are having the idea of holding far-right views be normalized. This is kind of easy to just reason out in your head, but we can easily see that people in these spheres, when surrounded by people who put a lot of time and energy into de-radicalization, start to see holding these beliefs as normal or even incidental. They begin to think that everyone had a Nazi phase when they were young, and that it's just a normal part of one's political journey. Second, we can see that the majority of voices in these spaces are white, which means that these people are having it reinforced that white people are, or at least can be, the authority on any and all issues. White people are the ones who teach you why it's wrong to be racist, what racism is, how it works, and thus white people must be the experts on racism. They haven't needed to listen to any non-white people to learn about these things, so clearly their voices aren't really that important. In fact, they might even know better than the minorities, and feel entitled to a voice on issues of race and racism. These two things merge into a perspective that has not fundamentally changed in many respects. These converts to leftism haven't needed to challenge their assumptions about race, gender, disability, or anything else, because their de-radicalization process didn't require them to challenge those assumptions. They learned everything from cis, white, abled people, and they never had to come to terms with the impact of their beliefs on others. The targets of their beliefs never had a voice in this process, and they never had a reason to seek those voices out, so what we've ended up with is someone who is nominally leftist, but who has not challenged the structures in society that prioritize the privileged over the marginalized. Something worth stating explicitly is that de-radicalization as an effort is very two-dimensional in this respect. Because it tends to prioritize white voices and experiences, it positions Nazism inside a binary perspective of good and evil. These efforts focus on converting people from being Nazis, but Nazis are not the only bad people on Earth. Nazism sucks in all respects, but there are groups other than Nazis who advocate and contribute to harm. This builds up a myth that converting someone from Nazism to leftism is enough, that becoming a leftist is enough of a change. This is untrue and dangerous. Leftists can still be bigoted and can still contribute to the oppression of marginalized people. There are plenty of leftist transmedicalists, for example, who think non-binary trans people and trans people who don't experience dysphoria should not be acknowledged as the gender they are, and who often uphold institutional barriers to accessing trans healthcare as a result. There are ableist leftists who ignore the needs of disabled people and make spaces inaccessible or dangerous to disabled people. Nazism is bad, and there being fewer Nazis is a good thing, but converting Nazis to leftism doesn't solve all these problems as easily as some people might want to believe, and highlighting Nazis to this extent can obscure more subtle and pernicious issues. The myth of the convert is a useful one for people who engage in de-radicalization, but as far as I can tell, it is a myth. These converts have not fundamentally changed in incredibly important ways. Worse still, these converts have been given the impression that they have learned all they need to and are ready to engage in conversations about leftist issues. Part 3. The Elephant and the Armchair. There's been an elephant in this room that I'm sure Jewish and BIPOC leftists have been waiting for me to bring up. White supremacy. White supremacy is the systemic and systematic prioritization of whiteness over non-whiteness. This takes many forms and can be deviously subtle. The dominance of European classical music as a symbol of high culture is white supremacy, the placing of white culture on a pedestal over non-white cultures. The normalization of whiteness as the default in media is white supremacy, making non-white seem like it doesn't belong or that it's abnormal. The dominance of white people as leaders in everything from art to politics to science is white supremacy, disproportionately placing power over the world in the hands of white people. White supremacy is all of these things and more. White supremacy is an inescapable element in this conversation, because de-radicalization is inextricably linked to it. De-radicalization efforts focus primarily on reactionaries, a group of mostly white people, and whether consciously or not, reinforce white supremacy by prioritizing white voices and experiences. The normalization of reactionary views and the whiteness of these spaces makes it impossible to discuss these issues without acknowledging that these efforts reinforce white supremacy. Many marginalized folks have been trying to point this out for a while, but white supremacy is a hell of a thing, and it has worked to create an explanation that prioritizes white people's perspectives over those of the marginalized. The concept of cancel culture is a rather commonly invoked one these days, but its use has had a sinister undertone of whiteness to it for a while now. Many explanations of cancel culture go into a sort of psychoanalysis of people to try to understand why they lash out, but in doing so, they ignore what these people are actually saying. Many of these people, in what honestly can't be reasonably explained as a coincidence, are marginalized, and expressing their views pretty clearly and reasonably. However, these people are reframed as a mob, as savage, bloodthirsty animals who are seeking to destroy the poor, innocent white people for no rational reason. The psychoanalysis here is not an honest attempt to understand, but rather an attempt to make white voices the authority in the conversation, and to undermine marginalized voices as simply lashing out in pain. It's concerning to me that this has become such a pervasive narrative, because it represents a reproduction of white supremacist norms within leftist communities. White people are in the positions of power and influence, with their voices being prioritized, while marginalized people are actively excluded and ignored. The discussion I've seen about the whiteness of online leftism between white leftists typically takes on a tone of confusion and concern. They wonder why there aren't more marginalized voices, and acknowledge it's a problem, but don't seem to recognize that these spaces do a lot to actively suppress and exclude marginalized voices. The subtle positioning of white voices as the authority on leftist issues in leftist spaces leads to this savior mentality, discussing issues for marginalized people rather than with them. I find the specific tendency to psychoanalyze to be especially gross. It takes a lot of nerve to ignore what marginalized people are saying in favor of presuming you can explain their own actions for them, but it takes even more nerve to do that while also playing into racist tropes of irrationality and inferiority. Marginalized folks actually know what they're talking about, and can be trusted with their own self-advocacy. Part 4. Redemption. De-radicalization online is a process that seems to have reinforced white supremacy within leftist spaces, but the normalization of reactionary views plays an interesting role in this. The idea that holding these beliefs is a normal phase in one's political development is one that serves to further white supremacy in leftist spaces, but also serves to take away all guilt from converts. Their beliefs were normal, expected, and had no consequences. They only believed those things because of peer pressure and propaganda, and we can all move past that now. Except no, we can't. Former reactionaries have been receiving a rather rude awakening lately as Jewish leftists and leftist people of color begin to more strongly push back on the idea that Nazism is normal and easily looked past. White former reactionaries have an expectation of forgiveness and acceptance when they become leftists, and have been indignant when marginalized people choose not to forgive them. They feel owed forgiveness and acceptance. After all, they apologized for being a Nazi, and the white streamers they watched and their white friends told them it's not a big deal. This is another centering of whiteness, though, at the expense of marginalized people. The targets of Nazism were not given a voice in this process of de-radicalization. Only the feelings and experiences of people who like to portray themselves as victims of circumstance for actively advocating genocide and bigotry. Marginalized people do not owe anyone forgiveness for wanting to oppress and exterminate them. That's not why you apologize. Apologies are recognition of wrongdoing and the consequences of your actions, not gift cards you can redeem for forgiveness. Nazism isn't a normal phase you go through, it's a disgusting and deeply worrying part of your past that you need to be willing to take accountability for. I say this as a person who used to be a reactionary, someone who watched anti-SJW YouTube, someone who was close to actively engaging in alt-right spaces. I am someone who became a leftist after being a reactionary. I'm not purity testing or taking some self-righteous moral high ground because I never did anything wrong. I clearly believe people can change, but that doesn't mean that anyone is owed the forgiveness of the people they hurt. Nobody owes me forgiveness for what I did when I was a reactionary, and I have no right to ask that of anyone. I never made it as far as being a Nazi, but that doesn't mean I didn't contribute to harm, that I didn't support people and causes that were damaging to marginalized communities and individuals. All I can do is work to be better and try to prove that I've changed. I don't get to dictate how the people I hurt are allowed to respond to that. There's been a significant amount of pushback to this idea from white former reactionaries, who apparently can only read this sentiment as believing something bad means you are eternally irredeemable. People who focus on de-radicalization in their work are quick to jump into these conversations and assert how important their work is, while these former reactionaries they defend proceed to give up on the people they harmed and pretend they're being unfairly maligned. This betrays the whiteness of these conversations. Former reactionaries are being prioritized over BIPOC voices because they feel unfairly maligned for their bigotry. This is about redemption. For white people in these spaces, their goal is not to become better or to listen, but to be redeemed. They want to be able to put their past behind them and be accepted with loving embrace into the arms of leftism, purified by their sacrifice. Abandoning their bigotry and reactionary views is not a selfless act. It is something done because it's supposed to earn them acceptance, to prove that they're good. They want to be redeemed. Jewish and BIPOC voices speaking up about the reality of the situation, the harm they contributed to, and their need to take responsibility for that, is perceived as persecution. They're trying to make them look bad, trying to get people to stop accepting them, trying to undo their redemption. After all, white redemption is the necessary prerequisite for being a white savior. How can you speak on behalf of marginalized people and save them if they won't accept that you're worthy of saving them? What is being a savior worth if the people you're saving don't worship you? Part 5. Conclusion. There's a tendency in online leftist spaces to prioritize efforts to de-radicalize and convert far-right reactionaries. This is partially because the far-right co-opting leftist language makes fundamentally different worldviews seem more compatible than they are, but mostly because of the centering of whiteness in discussions of leftist outreach. The focus on white perspectives creates a comforting illusion of reactionary views being a normal part of people's political development, and causes people to overlook the consequences of these beliefs. White leftists who were formerly reactionaries are thus functionally reproducing white supremacy within leftist spaces, by prioritizing white voices and dismissing marginalized ones, and expecting forgiveness and acceptance from marginalized people as part of a white savior complex. This is a subject that was brought to my attention by the marginalized folks I follow on social media, and I'm going to drop plenty of links in the description for folks to check out. Engaging with more marginalized voices will help give you the same reality check I desperately needed. The centering of whiteness in these discussions makes them much harder to have, and it's far too easy for the voices of marginalized folks to be reframed through ableist and racist attitudes if your feeds are primarily white voices discussing issues. I'm going to shout out a few of those marginalized folks who graciously agreed to help me with this script. Special thanks go to Professor Flowers and Anansi, two Black YouTubers who were kind enough to lend me their time to ensure I didn't massively fuck up discussing this subject. I also want to thank Korviday, who agreed to give me some feedback on the script, as well as Rory P., who helped screen some early drafts of the script for any major errors or oversights. I also want to briefly thank my new editor, Good L, who has been a wonderful help in the process of editing these latest videos. They've been a joy to work with, and I greatly appreciate their efforts to help make these videos possible. And of course, as always, thank you to my patrons who help support the work I try to put out here. I'll be putting my links underneath the big list of links to marginalized creators and voices, many of whom will be BIPOC, and others of whom will be white people who generally work to uplift BIPOC voices and amplify their messages. I appreciate folks supporting my work, but those voices are 100 times more important than mine. Please don't ignore those links. I appreciate your time, folks. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.